How the Bible Opposes 24-Hour Creation Days, brought to you by K. Scott Schaefer from politicallymoderatechristian.com. Most of this video is an excerpt from the book Where the Bible Contradicts Creationists, also by K. Scott Schaefer, available at amazon.com. Young Earth creationists who claim that we call God a liar if we believe the Bible supports an old universe, I call them traditional creation enforcers, insist that the Bible only allows for the days in the creation story to be 24 hours in length. However, I find that a literal reading of the Bible demonstrates otherwise. In this video, I will analyze the Bible verses that address the days of creation and the creation of the earth. Animal creation, etc. will be addressed in later videos. Genesis 1, verses 1 and 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was formless and void. And darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. This verse makes an important, yet often overlooked point. The earth did not exist on day one. It was not only void or empty, but it had no form. It was formless. The materials from which it formed may have been in existence somewhere, but they did not form a solid or liquid object, not a round one, a square one, or a flat one. Traditional creation enforcers have argued with me that in the Bible, formless doesn't really mean formless. So right off the bat, they are disagreeing with what the Bible literally says in order for the Bible to fit their theology. Neither was the earth submerged in water, as is the traditional belief, because it would have still had form and mass underwater. Therefore, anything that happened on day 1 or day 2, before the earth was created, cannot be something with which we are familiar, because we are only familiar with the processes that we experience on earth today. As for the waters, this verse makes it clear that they existed before God created any part of our universe. At this point in the story, the creation process had not yet begun. Therefore, the waters have to be where God dwells, not here on earth. They cannot be part of our universe since God had not begun work on it yet. Genesis 1, verses 3 to 5. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening and there was morning, one day. For centuries, Christians assumed these verses referred to the day and night we experience here on earth. They believed that even if the sun were extinguished, the day-night cycle would continue without it. If we travel through outer space, however, we see that the universe experiences no 24-hour day-night cycle. Therefore, we know that such a cycle is the result of the sun's presence in the earth's rotation and cannot be the day-night cycle to which Genesis 1:3-5 refers. In recent centuries, God has been gracious enough to show us through scientific discovery that the day and night we experience is the result of the earth rotating in a 24-hour period. If the earth rotated in a 75-hour period, a day would last 75 hours. If the earth rotated in a 5-hour period, a day would last 5 hours. If there was no earth at all, then how long would a day last? Well, that's a situation with which we are presented on the first day of creation. When we combine the fact that our day-night cycle results from Earth's rotation with what we know from verse 2, that the earth did not exist on the first day, we realize that the day-night cycle described in biblical creation cannot be the same one we experience today. Biblical creation's light and darkness refers to something different. It may refer to day and night in heaven, where God dwells, or it may refer to something no human has ever imagined. What it does not refer to is the 24-hour day-night cycle which we experience here on earth. Since that's the case, there's no reason to assign a 24-hour limit to the first day or any of the other days in the biblical creation account. To insist that these days were 24 hours in length could almost be considered anti-biblical because the Bible proves that these were not our days but God's days. God's days could have lasted as long as he wanted them to. If each day equaled 2 billion years, which is not my belief, but I'll address the issue in a later video, that fact would in no way conflict with the biblical account. Both God's biblical revelation and the facts he has revealed to us through scientific discovery lend no support to 24-hour creation days. The 24-hour day theory has no leg to stand on but that of creation. But let's pretend for a few moments that I'm wrong on this point. Even if there were an earth on day 1, the traditional interpretation still falls apart when challenged by the fact that light existed before the sun was created on day 4. Some traditional creation enforcers argue that the light God created was a temporary proto-sun and was replaced by the sun when it was created on day 4, but that's unlikely since everything else God created in chapter 1 continues to this day. Also, what would have been the point of God creating a temporary proto-sun? Nobody was alive to see it yet. Are we to believe that God needed the light to see? A light similar to our sun would have provided him no illumination at all as he created distant galaxies, since they are so far away. In fact, our sun provides very little light even for the planets in our outer solar system. so a proto-sun would have served no useful purpose. Many prominent traditional creation enforcers admit there's no scriptural support for a proto-sun, so they say that God himself was the light. They use Revelation 22:5 to support this conclusion. It says, "And they," Christians in heaven, "shall not have need of the light of a lamp nor the light of the sun, because the Lord God shall illumine them." However, there's a problem with this theory too. If God were the light during the creation process, as traditional creation enforcers claim, and he told the story from the only possible honest vantage point, his own, then there would have never been any night for God, because it would have been daytime wherever he went, because he was the light. Traditional creation enforcers might argue that the perspective of the creation story is not from God's vantage point, but from that of the Earth's surface. This theory, too, is problematic, due to the fact that God built his work schedule around the day-night cycle. We see throughout the creation process that God works each day, but then rests at night, as there was evening and there was morning between each act of creation. If God had only worked when his light caused daytime on Earth, then he would have never rested at night, because it's always daytime on 50% of the Earth's round surface at any given moment. There is never an absolute day or night. Only in a flat Earth model does the entire Earth experience daytime simultaneously. So it only makes sense that God built his schedule around the day-night cycle in his realm, not ours. So now, for the God is the light argument to work, God would have had to build his schedule around the vantage point of an imaginary person on the Earth's surface. When that person, who didn't exist, rotated to the side of the Earth facing God, God worked, and when this non-existent person rotated away from God, he rested. This scenario, of course, is preposterous, because there is absolutely no good reason why God would design his work schedule around the vantage point of a person who could not have existed at the time. I suppose traditional creation enforcers will argue that God would do it this way just to prove them right. But we see throughout the Bible that God doesn't seek to prove the arrogant religious establishment right, he seeks to prove them wrong. He told them through the prophets that their traditions were wrong, and he told the Pharisees through Jesus that their traditions were wrong. So it's unlikely that God went out of his way during the creation process to do pointless, nonsensical things just to prove today's arrogant religious establishment right. Genesis 1:6-8. Then God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." And God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. And God called the expanse heaven. And there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. Prior to the discovery of Earth's planethood, most people assumed that verses 6-8 describe the waters of the ocean being separated from the waters which are above the dome of the sky. We know today that the sky is not a dome, so the waters above the expanse did not reside atop our atmosphere. Rather, it's likely the waters were expanded so that our bubble of a universe could grow inside of them. For ages, people have asked what lies beyond the edge of the universe. According to the Bible, it's these waters. Here's an analogy that may not represent precisely what happened, but it's a helpful image to consider. Imagine that God, in his realm, has a large pool or pond filled with waters. On the first day of creation, he creates light in his realm. He ceases to work by day's end, and then, after the night passes, he returns to work in the second day. On this day, he creates an expanse in the midst of the waters. What's another word for an expanse in the midst of water? A bubble. So our universe is a bubble submerged beneath the surface of God's waters. In this illustration, God stands outside of his creation, much like we humans do with most of what we create. This view differs from the traditional interpretation, in which God creates the whole universe from inside while hovering over the Earth's surface, which to me seems like an inconvenient vantage point from which to create the entire universe. God may not have had an actual pool or pond, but I believe this illustration better depicts the environment from which God created our universe than the traditional interpretation does. Genesis 1:9-10. Then God said, "Let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear," and it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas, and God saw that it was good. The age-old assumption here was that the surface of the flat earth was completely covered with water, and that God had the waters recede into oceans and lakes, causing dry land to appear. However, knowing that the earth is not merely ground but also a round planet, we should no longer make this age-old assumption. The best explanation for verse 9 is that the dry land's appearance refers to the creation of the entire planet, and the gathering of the waters into one place refers to God drawing some of the water in the universe to earth. The gathering of the waters into one place could not have referred to the lakes and oceans, because lakes and oceans are scattered all over the face of the planet. They are hardly in one place. The one place of which this passage speaks is earth. Once the waters were gathered to this one place, then God called their resting places seas. If the words one place referred to a single place on the earth's surface, the word seas would not be plural, because the waters would be gathered into a singular sea. The waters below the heavens are waters inside the expanse. One might argue that inside is different than below, but remember that there is no such thing as up or down or above or below in our universe. Determining which way is up is a matter of perspective. A person on the ground sees a rocket go up, while a person in a space station sees the same rocket approach from below. So from an absolute perspective, there's no above or below, just as there's no absolute above or below in our universe. But from God's perspective, as he looked down on the expanse he had just created, the waters inside the expanse would have appeared below the expanse from his perspective. So the waters below the expanse are those that God left within our universe, while those above the expanse are those that surround our universe. Genesis 1:14-9. Then God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs, and for seasons, and for days and years. And let them be for lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth." And it was so. And God made two great lights, the greater to govern the day, and the lesser to govern the night. He made the stars also. And God placed them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, and to govern the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, a fourth day. On day 4, the first reason the Bible gives for God's creation of the sun, moon, and stars is to separate the day from the night. A couple of lines later, God assigns them the purpose to give light on the earth. And then again, he reiterates that they exist to separate the light from the darkness. These verses contradict the traditional interpretation of the creation account because light had already been created and day and night had already been separated on day 1. Once something has been separated, it cannot be separated again. If I tear the sleeve off of my shirt, I cannot remove it again without first sewing it back on. There's no biblical indication that God reunited the light and darkness he separated on day 1 so he could re-separate them on day 4. Day 1 and day 4 represent two different creations of day and night, the first one most likely in heaven and the second one on earth. Up to this point, the evenings and mornings to which the Bible refers existed where God dwells, not here on earth. Also, young earth creationists have often claimed that the waters of the Great Flood came from the waters which were above the expanse that resided atop Earth's atmosphere and then poured down as rain. However, the fact that verse 17 says God placed the sun, moon, and stars in the expanse and not above the expanse is proof that the expanse represents the entire universe and not only the Earth's atmosphere. So the floodwaters could not have come from the waters outside the expanse, or if they did, they would have had a heck of a long journey to get to Earth. Psalm 104, 5-9. He established the earth upon its foundations so that it will not totter forever. Thou didst cover it with the deep as with a garment. The waters were standing above the mountains. At thy rebuke they fled. At the sound of thy thunder they hurried away. The mountains rose. The valley sank down to the place which thou didst establish for them. Thou didst set a boundary that they may not pass over, that they may not return to cover the earth. Traditional creation enforcers claim that this passage speaks of Noah's flood and tells us that the mountains rose and the ocean basins formed as a result of the flood. Verse 5, however, addresses the creation of the earth. And, if we take it literally, the verse would have to be in error because the earth floats in space and has no foundations, as the scripture says. Fortunately, we are not to take this psalm literally. The book of Psalms differs greatly from the Bible's historical books, like Genesis, because many psalms are poetic offerings of praise to God. For example, the verses which precede these, verses 3 and 4, say, "He lays the beams of his upper chambers in the waters. He makes the clouds his chariot. He walks upon the wings of the wind. He makes the wind his messengers, flaming fire his ministers." Are we to believe that God rides clouds and that wind has wings? These verses are dramatic poetry, not literal history. Hebrews 11:3. By faith we understand that worlds were prepared by the word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible. The context here is that the writer begins to share how many of the Old Testament heroes looked forward to God's promises in faith, realizing that earth was not their eternal true home. Traditional creation enforcers have used this verse to oppose the idea of an old universe, claiming that the worlds appeared instantly from the sound of God's voice. However, there's no need to assume that the process was instant. Also, the idea that planets were made out of something invisible is consistent with the popular belief among astronomers that planets and stars form from clouds of gas that later cool and condense. Gases are generally invisible. That's the difference between gases and liquids. Ultimately, even the Big Bang Theory forms a universe out of the invisible. So there's no way this verse conflicts with the idea that the Bible can support an old universe. Genesis 2, 1-3. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their hosts. And by the seventh day God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created and made. Exodus 20:11. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. The context here is that this verse is explaining why God gave the fifth commandment, establishing the Sabbath day. Traditional creation enforcers often point to the Sabbath day's 24-hour duration as proof that the 6 days of creation were our 24-hour days and not God's days. This is, once again, an assumption that is inconsistent with the rest of the Bible. The Sabbath day is one of several biblical institutions that represent scaled-down versions of something heavenly. God creates these lesser earthly parallels for his people so they may get a taste of life in heaven with God. In the book of Hebrews, chapter 7, we learn that the Levitical priesthood is a lesser earthly parallel of Jesus. The priests lived temporarily and could not fully atone for the sins of God's people, but Jesus lived eternally and could fully atone for their sins. God gave the priesthood to the Israelites so they could have a taste of the grace of Christ, even though they did not live to see him. Also, the Temple of Jerusalem, God's dwelling place among the Israelites, was a lesser earthly parallel of heaven, God's true dwelling place. God gave his people a temple, and before that a tabernacle, so they could get a taste of having him dwell among them. In Colossians 2:16-17, we learn that the Sabbath day is one of these scaled-down gifts from God as well, since it says, Therefore let no one act as your judge in regard to food or drink or in respect to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day, things which are a mere shadow of what is to come. God himself enjoyed Sabbath rest, and from the sound of this verse, we will enjoy the Sabbath in heaven as well. But God wanted us to enjoy it here on earth too. In order for that to happen, God had to scale the Sabbath down to fit our 24-hour days. If God's creation days had lasted 1 billion years each, which is not my belief, but I will address this issue in a later video, it would be unrealistic for God to give us 1 billion years of Sabbath after we complete 6 billion years of work, because nobody would live long enough to reach the Sabbath. Again in Hebrews chapter 4, as the writer speaks of the Israelites in the Sinai desert who failed to believe God, verse 3 says, For we who have believed enter that rest, just as he said, As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. In verse 4, the writer links God's rest to the Sabbath. For he has thus said somewhere concerning the seventh day, And God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again in this passage, They shall not enter my rest. This verse implies that God's Sabbath rest continues to this day. When we leave this world and join God in heaven, we will enter God's Sabbath rest, which he still enjoys. In other words, it's likely that God is still in the seventh day of creation as we speak. He is still at rest. That doesn't mean he's totally idle, but that taking care of us is much less work than creating the universe. For God to take care of us during his Sabbath might be like one of us getting dressed for church on our Sabbath. It takes some effort, but it's not considered work. So if God is still at rest, then the seventh day did not last 24 earth hours. The day is measured in God's time, not ours. Stay tuned for next week's video entitled How God's View of the Order of Creation Differs from Ours.